At its peak, Smith Corona was rolling a finished typewriter off its Syracuse assembly line every 90 seconds. Not a car, not a refrigerator, a typewriter, and Americans could not get enough of them. In 1965, if you walked into a Sears, a Montgomery Ward, or a college bookstore anywhere in the United States, there it was, the Smith Corona Portable, sitting in its clamshell case, waiting. Students carried them into dormitories. Journalists hauled them into press boxes. Novelists set them on kitchen tables at midnight. The company held nearly half the portable typewriter market in America. And for a generation of working people, the name on the machine was as familiar as the name on their cereal box. Then, in the summer of 1995, Smith Corona filed for bankruptcy. The factory in Syracuse went silent. 3,000 people lost their jobs before Christmas. How does the company that put a typewriter in every American home fail to put a single piece of software on a single computer and disappear while the whole world was watching? Lyman Cornelius Smith was not a man who set out to change how America wrote. He set out to make guns. Born in 1850 in Cortland County, New York, LC, Smith spent his early career building shotguns in Syracuse. Good ones, reliable ones, the kind that earned a reputation across the Northeast. His company, LC Smith & Brothers, was a respectable arms manufacturer with a solid customer base and no particular reason to look elsewhere. But sometime in the late 1870s, Smith started paying attention to something new moving through American commerce. Not a weapon, a machine, a small mechanical device that could turn handwriting into something clean, uniform, and permanent. The typewriter was arriving in American offices, and L.C. Smith understood, before most people did, that it was not a novelty, it was infrastructure. In 1887, Smith and his brothers made the decision that would define the next 100 years of their family name. They sold the gun business and committed entirely to typewriters. The L.C. Smith & Brothers Typewriter Company was established in Syracuse, New York, and from the first day of production, the machines coming off that floor were built to a standard the market had not yet seen. Heavy, precise, engineered for the long haul. The office managers and courthouse clerks and newspaper editors who bought them in those early years were not buying a convenience. They were buying permanence. Across the state, in the small manufacturing town of Groton, New York, a different kind of typewriter company was taking shape. The Standard Folding Typewriter Company, which would eventually rename itself Corona, had a different philosophy entirely. Where Smith built for the desk, Corona built for the road. Their machines folded, they fit in a bag. A reporter could carry one on a train. A soldier could pack one in a footlocker. Corona understood something that the big office machine companies had not fully grasped. The person who needed a write was not always sitting at a desk. For nearly 4 decades, these two companies occupied different corners of the same market. Smith for the office, Corona for everywhere else. They were not enemies, but they were not the same animal either. Then came 1926. The merger that created Smith Corona was not a dramatic corporate raid or a hostile takeover. It was a practical decision made by practical men in a practical era. The American office was changing. The portable market was growing. And neither company, alone, had the full range to capture both. On paper, the logic was clean. Combine Smith's reputation for precision and durability with Corona's mastery of the portable form, and you had something that could serve every American who needed to put words on a page, at a desk, on a train, in a hotel room, at a kitchen table. The new company kept its headquarters in Syracuse. The name above the factory door read Smith Corona, and inside those walls, the combined workforce began producing machines that carried both bloodlines. The office models retained the weight and authority that L.C. Smith had always stood for. The portables kept the lean, road-ready engineering that had made Corona a favorite of journalists and travelers. What the merger created in those first years was not just a larger company, it was a more complete one. The timing was not accidental. The late 1920s were years of expansion in American commerce. Offices were multiplying. The clerical workforce was growing. Women were entering professional life in numbers that would have been unimaginable a generation earlier. And many of them were being hired specifically because they could type. The typewriter was no longer a novelty or a luxury. It was a professional credential. And Smith Corona, with its full range of machines from heavy office models to compact portables, was positioned to supply that credential to an entire nation. What Elsie Smith had seen in the late 1870s, that this machine was infrastructure, not invention, had proven exactly right. By the time the Depression hit and then the war years reshaped everything, Smith Corona had survived where others had not because it had built something people genuinely needed. The workers in Syracuse knew it. The salesmen who called on offices in Cleveland and Atlanta and Denver knew it. And the Americans who unwrapped a Smith Corona for the first time, setting it on a desk, feeding in the first sheet of paper, pressing the first key and hearing that sharp, definitive strike, they knew it too. Something real had been made in Syracuse, and for a while the whole country could feel it. The decade that made Smith Corona what it was did not begin with a product launch or an advertising campaign. It began with a generation of Americans coming home from the war with something they had never quite had before: the expectation that life was going to be better, and the belief that they had earned it. The post-war years remade the American household from the ground up. New houses in new suburbs, new schools filling with new children, a middle class that was larger and more confident than anything the country had produced before. And inside those new houses, on the new desks, in the new spare bedrooms, a new object was beginning to appear with increasing regularity. Not a television, though those were coming too. A typewriter, specifically in millions of cases, a Smith Corona. The machine that defined this era was the Silent Super. Released in the early 1950s, it came in a two-tone shell, cream and green or gray and burgundy depending on the year, and it sat in a hard clamshell case that snapped shut with a satisfying click. It weighed about 11 pounds. It had a full-size keyboard, a smooth platen, and a touch so responsive that typists who had grown up on heavier office machines were sometimes startled by how little effort it required. The name was not false advertising. Compared to the industrial clatter of a standard office model, the Silent Super was genuinely quiet. Quiet enough to use in a bedroom while someone slept in the next room. Quiet enough for an apartment. Quiet enough for a life that did not have a dedicated office. That was exactly the point. Smith Corona in the 1950s was not selling to corporations. It was selling to people. To the father who brought one home as a birthday gift for his daughter leaving for college. To the mother who used it to type the church bulletin every Thursday evening. To the veteran who had come back from Korea and was working on something he could not quite talk about yet. A novel, maybe, or just a record of what he had seen. The Silent Super fit into ordinary American life because it was designed for ordinary American life. The Sterling followed, and then the Clipper, and then the Skywriter. Each one slightly lighter, slightly more refined. Each one aimed at a slightly different version of the same person, someone who needed to write and wanted a machine that would not get in the way. The Skywriter, introduced in 1953, weighed under 6 pounds. You could carry it onto an airplane. You could set it on your lap on a train. It was the lightest full-featured portable typewriter on the American market, and it sold to journalists, academics, and traveling salesmen who had never believed a portable could feel this capable. The experience of owning one of these machines was specific in a way that is difficult to convey to someone who did not live it. You opened the case and the smell hit you first. A combination of machine oil, rubber, and something faintly chemical that clung to the ribbon. You fed the paper in, turned the platen knob until the sheet caught, and then you began. The keys had resistance. Not too much, not too little, just enough to feel like the machine was meeting you halfway. Each keystroke produced a sound, a sharp tap, then the mechanical sweep of the type arm, then the faint smack of ink against paper. At the end of every line, the bell rang, a small, clear note, neither loud nor soft, that said, "You have reached the margin. Start again." That bell became one of the defining sounds of mid-century American domestic life. If you grew up in a house where someone typed, a parent working late, a sibling finishing a school paper, a grandparent keeping correspondence, you heard it. You fell asleep to it sometimes. It marked time the way a clock did, but with the added meaning that someone in the house was making something. The schools understood what the machine represented. By the late 1950s, typing class had become a fixture of the American junior high and high school curriculum, and Smith Corona machines were in those classrooms in enormous numbers. Entire rows of Sterlings and Clipper models bolted to long wooden tables. Every student learning the same thing, that competence at a keyboard was a skill the world would reward. Secretarial for girls, many teachers implied, but the boys were paying attention too, and the lesson landed on all of them. A generation of Americans learned to type on Smith Corona machines, which meant that when it came time to buy their own, there was only one name they trusted. By 1960, Smith Corona's portable line was outselling every competitor in the United States. The company employed more than 5,000 people in and around Syracuse. The factory ran in shifts. The machines going out the shipping dock were going to every state in the country, to department stores and college bookstores and office supply shops and Sears catalog orders. In the 1962 Sears Christmas wish book, the Smith Corona Sterling appeared on a full page, priced at $69.95, positioned between a set of luggage and a portable record player as the kind of gift a thoughtful parent gave to a child they believed in. What was it about that logo? The clean Smith Corona script across the front of the machine. That made a person feel, when they sat down to it, that what they were about to write actually mattered. The answer, though nobody said it in those terms, was that the machine made the act of writing feel serious, permanent, real. A handwritten page could be dismissed. A typed page looked finished. It looked like something that had been decided. The Smith Corona did not just record your words. It transformed them into something that resembled, however faintly, the printed word. And in a culture that still believed deeply in the authority of print, that transformation meant something. The company's advertising understood this instinctively. The campaigns of the late 1950s and early 1960s did not sell features. They sold identity. A young woman in a crisp blouse, fingers on the keys, looking not at the machine but straight ahead, confident, capable, already somewhere the machine was helping her go. A father presenting a clamshell case to a son in a graduation gown. A writer at a window, city lights below, the typewriter open on the desk. These images circulated through magazines and television screens and newspaper supplements, and they worked because they were not entirely fictional. This was how people actually used the machine. This was what it actually meant to own one. The golden years of Smith Corona were not loud. They did not announce themselves. They accumulated season by season, Christmas by Christmas, school year by school year, until the brand had become so embedded in American life that most people never thought about it consciously at all. It was simply there, in the spare room, in the closet, in the case under the bed. Ready when you needed it, reliable in the way that good tools are reliable, without demanding attention or gratitude. It would take years before anyone realized how much they would miss it when it was gone. The decision to expand felt at the time like the only logical move a successful company could make. By the early 1960s, Smith Corona had done what few American manufacturers had managed to do with such consistency. It had built a product that people trusted, priced it within reach of the middle class, and put it into enough homes and schools that an entire generation associated the brand with the act of writing itself. The question was no longer whether Smith Corona could sell typewriters. The question was how many more of them it could sell, and to whom. The answer came in the form of electricity. IBM had introduced the electric typewriter in 1935, but it was the IBM Model A of the post-war years, and most significantly, the IBM Selectric of 1961 that changed the conversation entirely. The Selectric did not just add a motor to an existing design. It replaced the moving carriage with a stationary platen and a rotating type ball. A golf ball-sized element that spun to the correct character and struck the paper with a speed and consistency no manual machine could match. In offices across America, the Selectric became the new standard almost immediately. It was faster. It was cleaner. It made every page look like it had come from a professional print shop. Smith Corona could not ignore this. The company had always been strongest in the portable market. The personal machine, the home machine, the student machine. But the office market was where the volume was, and the office market was going electric. In the early 1960s, Smith Corona launched its own electric line. The Smith Corona Electra arrived in showrooms with a full advertising push, priced below the Selectric and positioned as the sensible alternative for offices that wanted the benefits of electric typing without the IBM price tag. The Electra was a capable machine. It worked. It sold reasonably well. But it was not a Selectric, and the people buying it knew it. This was the first tension that Smith Corona's expansion era could not resolve. The company was trying to compete with IBM in a segment where IBM had set the terms, while simultaneously trying to defend its dominant position in the portable segment where its identity lived. These were not contradictory goals in theory. In practice, they pulled the organization in opposite directions. Engineering resources that might have gone into perfecting the next generation of portables were diverted toward chasing IBM's lead in the office market. Marketing budgets were split. The brand that had meant one specific thing, the reliable, personal, go-anywhere portable, began to mean something slightly less specific. The growth numbers, however, looked good. Through the mid-1960s, Smith Corona continued to expand its distribution network aggressively. The company deepened its relationship with Sears, whose catalog remained one of the most powerful retail channels in the country. It pushed into department stores, college bookstores, and the growing chains of office supply retailers that were beginning to appear in suburban shopping centers. The machines were moving. Revenue was climbing. Headcount at the Syracuse facilities was increasing year by year, and the factory floor ran at capacity for most of the decade. The portable line kept evolving too. The Corona-Matic, introduced in the late 1960s, offered a cartridge ribbon system that made changing ribbons cleaner and faster. An ergonomic improvement that addressed one of the most persistent complaints about portable typewriters and gave Smith Corona's salespeople a genuine talking point against competitors. The Corona-Matic sold well and reinforced the company's reputation for practical innovation. Not flashy, not revolutionary, but genuinely useful. What the expansion era also produced, though nobody was writing about it in the annual reports, was a creeping diffusion of the brand's core identity. In the early 1950s, a Smith Corona meant something very specific, a well-built portable typewriter made in Syracuse, New York, designed for the person who wanted to write wherever life took them. By the early 1970s, Smith Corona meant a range of products: manual portables, electric portables, office electrics, cartridge systems, accessories, and a growing line of adding machines and calculators, spread across a distribution network that ran from college towns to corporate supply rooms to Christmas catalogs. Bigger was not automatically better. The franchise owners and regional sales managers who had built their businesses on the strength of the portable line were now being asked to sell a wider catalog to a wider customer base. Some of them thrived on it. Others found that the simplicity that had made Smith Corona easy to sell. This is the typewriter. It is reliable. It works. Was getting harder to communicate when the product line ran across 4 pages of a sales brochure. There was also the matter of what was happening in the broader technology landscape, though in the early 1970s it registered as background noise rather than alarm. Calculators were replacing adding machines. Photocopiers were changing office workflows. The first word processing systems, enormous, expensive, room-sized machines built by IBM and Xerox and Wang, were beginning to appear in the largest corporations. None of this seemed immediately relevant to the person buying a portable typewriter for a college-bound daughter. But in the offices where Smith Corona's electric machines were competing, the people making purchasing decisions were beginning to ask questions that had not come up before. What else could a machine do? What happened if the tool did more than type? Smith Corona did not have an answer to those questions in 1972. Neither did most of the typewriter industry. The honest truth is that almost nobody did. The personal computer was still nearly a decade away from being a consumer product. And the idea that a device small enough to sit on a desk could replace an entire office's worth of specialized machines seemed, to most serious business people, more like science fiction than strategic planning. But the seeds were already in the ground. The expansion machine that Smith Corona had built through the 1960s and into the 1970s was impressive, profitable, and pointed in exactly the right direction for the world as it existed. The problem that would not become visible for several more years, was that the world was about to become something else entirely. The peak was real, it was earned, and it was almost over. By 1979, Smith Corona was the best-selling typewriter brand in the United States. That sentence deserves a moment. Not the best-selling portable, not the best-selling manual, the best-selling typewriter across all categories in the largest consumer market on earth. The company's Syracuse facilities employed more than 5,000 people. The machines were in schools in every state, in the offices of small businesses from Maine to California, in the spare rooms and kitchen tables of a middle class that had made the portable typewriter as standard a household item as a sewing machine or a set of encyclopedias. If you were an American between the ages of 15 and 60 in 1979, the odds were better than even that you had typed on a Smith Corona at some point in your life. Many of you owned one. Some of you had owned two. The advertising of this period understood exactly what the brand had become. The television campaigns of the late 1970s did not compete on specifications. They competed on belonging. One campaign, which ran nationally in 1977 and 1978, showed a series of ordinary Americans. A high school student, a small business owner, a woman returning to work after raising children, each of them sitting down to a Smith Corona with the quiet confidence of someone picking up a tool they already knew how to use. The tagline was simple, almost understated: Smith Corona, the one America types on. It was not a boast. It was a statement of fact delivered as though everyone in the room already knew it, which by that point they largely did. The generational reach of the brand during this period was something that the marketing materials gestured at but could never fully capture. A grandmother in Cincinnati had learned to type on a Corona portable in 1943 when her husband was overseas and she had taken a job at an insurance office to keep the household running. Her daughter had received a Smith Corona Sterling as a high school graduation gift in 1961. Her granddaughter was using a Smith Corona Coronomatic in her college dormitory in 1978. 3 generations, 3 different machines, the same name on everyone. That kind of continuity does not happen by accident. It happens because a product earns trust at a moment when trust matters, and then keeps earning it year by year until the brand becomes indistinguishable from the activity itself. In the schools, the relationship was even more foundational. Typing class remained a core part of the American secondary school curriculum through the 1970s, and Smith Corona machines dominated those classrooms in a way that no competitor came close to matching. Districts bought them in lots of 20 and 30. The machines were bolted to long tables and rows, and students sat in front of them 5 days a week, learning the home row, learning rhythm, learning that the fingers had a memory of their own if you gave them enough repetition. A generation of Americans, the ones who are in their 50s and 60s today, learned the fundamental skill of keyboard literacy on a Smith Corona. When they graduated and went to work, they brought that muscle memory with them. And when they needed a typewriter of their own, they went looking for the machine their hands already knew. The Coronomatic line represented the peak of Smith Corona's engineering ambition in this era. The cartridge ribbon system had solved the messiest problem in portable typewriting, the inky, fiddly process of threading a new ribbon through the machine, and replaced it with a clean, simple cartridge that snapped in and out in seconds. The correction ribbon, introduced in the mid-1970s, went further still. A dedicated ribbon loaded with a white correction compound that let typists lift a mistyped character cleanly off the page without reaching for the bottle of whiteout. It was a small innovation by any technical measure, but to the person sitting at the machine at 10 o'clock at night, 3 pages into a term paper with a deadline in the morning, it was close to miraculous. The company's position in the market at the end of the 1970s was, by any conventional measure, unassailable. Market share was strong. Brand recognition was near universal. The distribution network was deep and established. The workforce was experienced and stable. The union contracts in Syracuse were fair by the standards of the era, and turnover was low enough that the factory floor held people who had been building typewriters for 20 and 25 years. Craftspeople, in the truest sense, who knew every component of every model and took a personal pride in what came off the line. Could anyone standing on the Syracuse factory floor in 1979, watching those machines move down the line at their steady, reliable pace, have imagined that in 16 years the company would be filing for bankruptcy? Could anyone have looked at those sales figures, that brand recognition, that generational loyalty, and predicted that the name Smith Corona would within a decade become a footnote in a story about American industrial decline? The answer, if you knew where to look, was already walking through the door. In the summer of 1981, IBM announced a product that nobody in the typewriter industry had been asked to compete with before. It was not a typewriter. It was not an office system. It was a personal computer, small enough to sit on a desk, priced at under $2,000, and designed for the same customer that Smith Corona had spent 50 years serving. The individual American who needed to put words on a page. The machine that had defined a century was about to meet the machine that would end it. And Smith Corona, at the absolute height of its power and prestige, had almost no time left to decide what to do next. The IBM personal computer arrived in American stores in August of 1981 with a price tag of $165 and a marketing campaign that borrowed heavily from the language of accessibility. This was not a machine for corporations, IBM insisted. This was a machine for everyone. Smith Corona's leadership read the announcement and reached a conclusion that was, by the standards of 1981, entirely reasonable. Typewriters and personal computers were different tools for different purposes. A PC was expensive, complicated, and required a level of technical literacy that most ordinary Americans did not yet possess. A Smith Corona portable cost $150 and worked the moment you took it out of the case. The markets were not the same. The customers were not the same. The threat, if there was one, was distant and manageable. They were not wrong about 1981. They were catastrophically wrong about 1985. The speed at which personal computers moved from corporate curiosity to household appliance remains one of the most dramatic market transformations in American commercial history. The Apple IIe, released in January of 1983, became the dominant machine in American schools almost overnight, displacing, in classroom after classroom, the very rows of Smith Corona typewriters that had anchored typing education for 2 decades. The IBM PC clone market exploded through 1983 and 1984, driving prices down faster than any industry analyst had projected. And in the spring of 1983, a piece of software called WordPerfect began its quiet, unstoppable march across American offices. WordPerfect did not look like a threat from the outside. It was a word processing program. Functional, not beautiful, with a learning curve steep enough to frustrate new users for weeks before the logic of it clicked into place. But for anyone who worked through that learning curve, the experience on the other side was transformative. You could edit. You could move paragraphs. You could fix a mistake on page 3 without retyping pages 4 through 12. You could print a clean final copy the moment you were satisfied, and then print another one tomorrow if you needed it, and another one the week after that without touching the original again. The typewriter could not do any of this. The typewriter was permanent in a way that had once felt like a virtue and now began to feel like a limitation. Smith Corona's response to this landscape was the personal word processor, the PWP line, introduced in stages beginning in 1985. The concept was defensible, a machine that combined the simplicity and portability of a typewriter with basic word processing functions, priced between $200 and $500, aimed at the customer who found a full personal computer intimidating or unnecessary. You could type on it like a typewriter. You could edit on its small built-in display before committing text to paper. You could store documents on a built-in memory system. It was, in theory, the best of both worlds. In practice, it satisfied neither. The customers who wanted a true word processor quickly discovered that the PWP's editing capabilities, limited screen display, restricted memory, no ability to run other software, fell short of what even a modestly priced PC could offer. The customers who wanted a typewriter found the PWP more complicated and more expensive than the machine they already knew how to use. The product sat between two markets without fully belonging to either one, and in retail showrooms across the country, sales staff struggled to explain exactly who it was for. A regional sales manager for Smith Corona, based in upstate New York, attended a national office products trade show in Chicago in the fall of 1984. He walked the floor for 2 days. He watched the demonstrations at the WordPerfect booth, at the Lotus booth, at the booths of the PC clone manufacturers who were selling IBM-compatible machines for prices that dropped visibly from one trade show to the next. On the flight home, he wrote a memo to his district supervisor. The memo described what he had seen in plain language. The word processing software running on personal computers was not a compliment to the typewriter market. It was a replacement for it. The customers Smith Corona was counting on were not going to split their purchases between a PC and a typewriter. They were going to buy the PC and never look back. The memo made it up the chain. Whether it changed anything in the executive suite is not documented. What is documented is that Smith Corona's strategic response in the years that followed remained centered on the PWP line and incremental improvements to the existing typewriter range, not on any fundamental rethinking of what the company was and what it needed to become. By 1988, the American typewriter market had shrunk by more than 40% from its 1978 peak. Smith Corona was still the market leader, but leading a shrinking market is a different thing entirely from leading a growing one. The company's revenues were declining. The factory in Syracuse was running below capacity for the first time in decades. And the PC market, which had seemed distant and manageable in 1981, was now sitting in the living rooms and home offices of the exact customers who had once saved up for a Smith Corona Chronomatic. How long could a brand this trusted, this embedded in American life, hold itself together against a force it had never been designed to resist? The people on the factory floor in Syracuse could feel the answer in the numbers of machines coming off the line each shift. The numbers were going in one direction. They had been going that direction for several years, and the decisions that might have reversed them, the hard, expensive, identity-altering decisions, were not being made with anything close to the speed the moment required. Something was coming. Everyone inside the company sensed it, and the people at the top were running out of time to stop it. The decision that defined Smith Corona's final chapter was not made in Syracuse. In 1986, the British conglomerate Hansen plc acquired Smith Corona's parent company, SCM Corporation, as part of a larger takeover deal valued at approximately $930 million. Hansen was not a technology company. It was not a manufacturing company in any meaningful sense. It was a conglomerate built on the philosophy of acquiring undervalued industrial assets, extracting maximum short-term returns, and moving on. Its chairman, Lord Hansen, was celebrated in the British financial press as a ruthless and effective deal-maker. What he was not, and never claimed to be, was someone who understood the American typewriter market or cared particularly about its future. Under Hansen's ownership, the strategic pressure on Smith Corona shifted in a direction that would prove fatal. The question was no longer how to reinvent the company for a changing market. The question was how to maintain profitability in a shrinking one. These are not the same question, and the answers they produce are not the same answers. Reinvention requires investment in research and engineering, in the willingness to cannibalize existing product lines before a competitor does it for you. Profitability maintenance in a shrinking market requires cost reduction. Hansen chose cost reduction. The most consequential cost reduction decision came in 1992. After years of declining sales volume and rising labor costs relative to overseas competitors, Smith Corona announced that it would close its manufacturing operations in Cortland, New York, and shift production to a new facility in Nogales, Mexico. The Cortland plant had been part of the Smith Corona story since the Corona Typewriter Company days. It employed approximately 3,000 people in a region of upstate New York that had few alternative employers of comparable scale. The announcement was made in the fall. The closures began before the end of the year. The reaction in Cortland was not abstract. It was the specific, grinding devastation of a community that had built itself around a single industry and was now being told that industry had decided to leave. Workers who had spent 20 and 25 years on the factory floor received their notices and understood, with the clarity that comes from living in a place with limited options, that there was no equivalent job waiting for them in the next county. The machinists, the assembly workers, the quality control inspectors, the supervisors who had trained 3 generations of employees. They filed out of the plant for the last time and took with them a combined institutional knowledge that no facility in Nogales could replicate in months or years. The move to Mexico did reduce production costs. It did not save the company because the company's problem was not production costs. The problem was that the product being produced more cheaply in Nogales was a product for which the American market was contracting by double digits every year. You cannot cut your way to growth. You cannot manufacture your way out of a platform shift. The typewriter was not losing market share because it was too expensive to make. It was losing market share because a different machine had made it obsolete, and no reduction in unit cost was going to change that fundamental reality. Inside the company during these years, the people who understood what was happening were not silent. Engineers who had worked on the PWP line had been arguing since the mid-1980s that the only viable path forward was a genuine pivot, not a typewriter with a small screen, but a real commitment to developing software and hardware that could compete in the emerging personal computing market. The arguments were technically sound. They were also expensive, uncertain, and deeply threatening to a corporate parent whose investment thesis was built on extraction rather than transformation. The PWP line continued to evolve through the late 1980s and into the early 1990s, and some of the later models were genuinely impressive pieces of engineering for what they were. The Smith Corona PWP-3 and its successors offered expanded memory, improved displays, and spell check functions that worked well enough to be useful. In a different competitive environment, one where Microsoft Word was not already becoming the universal standard for document creation, these machines might have found a sustainable niche. But Microsoft Word had shipped in 1983, and by 1990, it was running on IBM-compatible PCs that cost less than $1,000 and could do everything the PWP did, and 10,000 things the PWP could not. The niche that Smith Corona was trying to occupy was closing from both sides simultaneously. The retail environment was delivering the verdict in real time. Throughout the early 1990s, the major office supply chains, Office Depot had opened in 1986, Staples in 1986, Office Max in 1988, were expanding rapidly. And the floor space they allocated to typewriters was shrinking with every store reset. The machines moved to smaller sections, then to clearance areas, then to end caps near the back of the store. Sales staff who had once been trained to walk customers through the differences between the Coronomatic and the PWP were now steering those same customers toward the PC aisle, where the margins were better and the customers were more certain about what they wanted. Who exactly was supposed to protect the people who had spent their careers building these machines? The workers in Cortland, the engineers in Syracuse, the franchise dealers who had staked their businesses on the Smith Corona name. The corporate parent was in London, focused on its quarterly returns. The executive suite was managing a decline rather than engineering a recovery. And the market was not waiting for anyone to catch up. By 1993, Microsoft Word had become the default word processing standard in American offices. By 1994, the personal computer had crossed a price threshold, under $1,000 for a capable machine, that put it within reach of the same middle-class households that had once saved up for a Smith Corona portable. The overlap between the two customer bases, which Smith Corona's leadership had spent a decade insisting was not a direct conflict, had collapsed entirely. The end was no longer a question of whether, it was a question of when and how fast and how much it was going to hurt. On July 5, 1995, Smith Corona Corporation filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in the United States Bankruptcy Court for the District of Delaware. The filing was not a surprise to anyone who had been paying attention. The financial press had been tracking the company's deteriorating position for years. The stock price had been declining since the late 1980s. The successive rounds of cost-cutting, the move to Mexico, the shrinking retail footprint, all of it had been visible to anyone reading the quarterly reports. But the formal declaration of bankruptcy still landed with a particular weight because Smith Corona was not an abstract corporate entity. It was a name that lived in people's houses. It was the machine on which millions of Americans had written the most important documents of their lives. College applications, cover letters, the first drafts of things that mattered. Seeing that name attached to a bankruptcy filing felt, to a great many people, like reading an obituary for someone they had known personally. The Syracuse Herald-Journal ran the story on the front page. The coverage was straightforward in its facts and unmistakably elegiac in its tone. Reporters called former employees, called local officials, called the small business owners in Cortland and Syracuse, whose livelihoods had been tied to the company for decades. What they got back was not anger, exactly, though anger was present, but something closer to grief. The particular grief of people who had believed in something and watched it be diminished, piece by piece, until the diminishment became official. In retail stores across the country, the news created a specific and strange kind of moment. Office supply chains that still carried Smith Corona products, and many of them did because the machines had not stopped working just because the company had filed for bankruptcy, found themselves fielding questions from customers who had heard the news and wanted to know what it meant. Was the warranty still good? Would they still be able to get ribbons? Were these the last ones? In some stores, the filing triggered a modest buying surge. People who had been considering a typewriter purchase for months and now felt the urgency of scarcity. They were buying a machine, but they were also buying something else, a piece of a world they could feel slipping away. The bankruptcy reorganization plan that Smith Corona submitted to the court was built around a fundamental reinvention of what the company would be. The typewriter business, as a consumer product line, was effectively over. The company still had manufacturing expertise, still had machinery, still had a workforce. Smaller now and relocated, but functional. The pivot that the executive team proposed was to thermal labels and thermal ribbons, products used in warehouses, shipping operations, and retail environments for printing barcodes and inventory tags. It was not glamorous. It bore almost no relationship to the brand identity that generations of Americans had grown up with. But it was a market that existed, that was growing, and that Smith Corona's ribbon manufacturing capabilities could serve without requiring the kind of transformational investment the company had never been willing to make when it might have mattered. The company emerged from Chapter 11 in 1995 and attempted to execute this pivot while maintaining a diminished presence in the typewriter market. A small line of typewriters continued to be sold under the Smith Corona name through the late 1990s. Machines manufactured in Mexico, sold through a shrinking number of retail channels, serving a customer base that was aging and contracting and had no younger generation coming up behind it. These were not bad machines. The engineering that had made Smith Corona portables reliable in 1955 had not disappeared, but the context in which that reliability mattered had disappeared entirely. And a well-built typewriter in 1997 was a well-built artifact from another era. The employees who had survived the Cortland closure and the multiple rounds of restructuring moved through these years with the particular exhaustion of people who had already grieved once and were being asked to grieve again. A woman who had worked in Smith Corona's customer service department in Syracuse for 18 years described, in an interview with a local newspaper in 1996, what it had been like to answer phones during the bankruptcy filing. Customers called to ask about their warranties. Former employees called to ask about their pensions. Dealers called to ask about their inventory. She answered every call, she said, because that was the job. But there came a point, sometime in the fall of 1995, when she understood that the company she was answering phones for was not really the company she had signed on to work for in 1978. That company was already gone. She was working for something that had borrowed its name. The second bankruptcy filing came in 2000. This one did not carry the shock of the first because by 2000 the story had been fully told. The personal computer had won. Word processing software had won. The typewriter as a consumer product had not merely declined, it had effectively ceased to exist as a category in the American retail market. The Smith Corona name survived the second filing attached to the thermal label business, which continued to operate and generates revenue to this day. But the typewriters stopped. The last Smith Corona typewriter rolled off a production line in the early years of the new century, without ceremony, without press coverage, without anyone marking the moment as the end of something that had once been everywhere. Somewhere in America, on the day that happened, someone was sitting in front of a Smith Corona that still worked perfectly, a Sterling from 1962, or a Corona-Matic from 1974, or a PWP from 1989, and typing. Not because they had to, because they wanted to, because the machine did something to the act of writing that no other machine had ever quite replicated. They did not know that the last new Smith Corona had just been made. They were not thinking about the company at all. They were thinking about what they were writing. And the bell at the end of the line rang, clean and clear, the way it always had. The space that Smith Corona left behind was not filled by a single competitor or a cleaner version of what it had been. It was filled by an entire ecosystem that the typewriter had never been designed to compete with. Microsoft Word became the default instrument of American written communication so completely and so quickly that within a decade of Smith Corona's bankruptcy, the idea of composing a document on anything other than a word processor had become, for most Americans, genuinely unimaginable. The personal computer did not just replace the typewriter's function. It absorbed it, buried it under 100 other functions, and made the original function, putting words on a page, seem almost incidental to what the machine was really for. The typewriter had been singular. It did one thing. It did that one thing well enough that generations of Americans built their working lives around it. The computer did everything, which meant that the particular intimacy of the typewriter, the directness of the relationship between the person and the page, dissolved into a device that also ran spreadsheets and played games and connected to a network and eventually fit in your pocket. The Smith Corona name did not disappear entirely. The successor company that emerged from the second bankruptcy reorganization continued to operate in the thermal label and ribbon market, selling products to warehouses, logistics companies, and retail operations that needed to print barcodes and shipping tags. The business was real and the revenue was real, but the connection to what the name had once meant was purely nominal. If you searched for Smith Corona online in 2005 and found the company's website, you found a supplier of industrial labeling products. Nothing on the page would have told you that this was the company that had taught America to type. The physical legacy of Smith Corona in Syracuse and Cortland was the kind that Rust Belt communities know too well. The factory buildings remained after the workers left. Large, solid, expensive to demolish, and difficult to repurpose. Some were converted. Some sat vacant for years, their windows darkening, their loading docks going quiet in a way that everyone in the surrounding neighborhoods could feel, even if they did not talk about it directly. The tax base that the company had supported for decades contracted. The small businesses, the diners, the hardware stores, the dry cleaners, that had depended on the spending of 5,000 factory workers contracted with it. Cortland and the surrounding region had been living with the consequences of deindustrialization before Smith Corona left. But the company's departure accelerated a decline that the community is still navigating today. The broader industry lesson that Smith Corona's collapse offered was one that American business would spend the following 2 decades learning and relearning, often the hard way. The lesson was not simply that technology changes markets. Everyone knew that. The lesson was about the specific danger of incremental response to transformational change. Smith Corona had not ignored the personal computer. It had responded to it with the PWP line, with modest product evolution, with cost restructuring, but every response had been calibrated to protect the existing business rather than to build a new one. The company had tried to survive the transition rather than lead it, and in a transition of that magnitude, survival mode thinking is almost always insufficient. Kodak would follow the same arc. Polaroid would follow it. Blockbuster would follow it. The details of each collapse were different, but the underlying pattern was identical. A dominant company with genuine brand loyalty and deep market penetration, confronted with a platform shift it understood intellectually, but could not bring itself to act on with the speed and commitment the moment required. In each case, the company's strength became its weakness. The very depth of its investment in the existing model, the factories, the distribution networks, the institutional culture built around a specific product, made the cost of abandoning that model feel prohibitive until abandoning it was no longer a choice. What do we lose when a brand disappears and nothing takes its place in quite the same way? The question is not sentimental, though sentiment is part of it. It is a question about what certain kinds of products do for the people who use them that cannot be fully accounted for in a market analysis. The typewriter gave its users something specific, a physical, mechanical, irreversible engagement with the act of writing. Every word you typed was a commitment. You could not cut and paste. You could not undo. You could not save a draft and return to it later in a different mood. You sat down, you decided, and you typed. The permanence that had once seemed like a limitation turned out, for many writers and thinkers who lived through the transition, to have been a discipline, a constraint that forced a kind of clarity that the infinitely editable word processor did not require and could not replace. This is not an argument that the typewriter was better than the word processor. It was not by almost any practical measure. It is an argument that things are lost in transitions that cannot be recovered by the technology that causes them, and that Smith Corona, at its best, had provided something more than a machine. It had provided a relationship between a person and a page that was tactile, immediate, and entirely their own. The vintage market confirmed what the commercial market had abandoned. By the early 2000s, Smith Corona typewriters from the 1950s and 1960s were appearing on eBay in growing numbers, selling to collectors, writers, and people who had grown up with them and wanted them back. A sterling in good condition, which had sold new for $69.95 in the 1962 Sears catalog, was fetching $75 to $150 on the secondary market, roughly equivalent in real terms, which suggested that the perceived value had not diminished so much as migrated from the new product market to the preservation market. Repair technicians who specialize in vintage typewriters, a profession that had seemed headed for extinction, found themselves with more work than they could handle. The machine had outlasted the company. It usually does. Picture a kitchen table in the fall of 1967. The dishes have been cleared. The children are in bed. A lamp is on at one end of the table, and under it sits a Smith Corona Sterling. Seafoam green, the paint worn slightly at the edges of the spacebar from years of use. A woman sits down, feeds a sheet of paper into the platen, turns the knob until the paper catches, and begins. The keys are cool under her fingers for the first moment, and then they are not. The machine warms to the touch the way familiar things do. She is writing a letter or finishing a report for work, or working on something private that no one else will read for a long time. It does not matter which. What matters is the sound, the steady, purposeful percussion of someone making something, and the bell at the end of each line, ringing once into the quiet house, marking the margin, calling for the next thought. That sound is gone from American houses now. Not forbidden, not forgotten entirely, but gone from daily life the way so many specific sounds have gone. The rotary dial completing its arc, the needle finding the groove, the particular mechanical click of a camera shutter that meant film was advancing. These were not merely sounds. They were the acoustic signatures of a way of living. And when the objects that made them disappeared, they took something of the texture of ordinary life with them. The Smith Corona typewriter was one of those objects. For roughly 4 decades, from the post-war years through the early 1990s, it was the instrument through which millions of Americans translated thought into permanent form. It asked something of them in return: attention, commitment, the willingness to decide before striking the key. And most of them gave it without thinking of it as a sacrifice. What Smith Corona provided, at its best, was not a product in the transactional sense. It was a relationship. Between a person and a machine, yes, but more precisely, between a person and the act of writing itself. The typewriter imposed a discipline that the word processor would spend decades trying to replicate with features, autosave, revision history, focus mode. Because the discipline had been structural in the original machine and could not be fully rebuilt in software. You sat down to a Smith Corona with intention because the machine rewarded intention and punished inattention in equal measure. A mistyped line cost you something: time, effort, the clean surface of the page. That cost made you careful in a way that mattered, and the carefulness, over years of practice, became a habit of mind that extended beyond the machine itself. The workers who built these machines in Syracuse and Cortland brought their own form of that discipline to the factory floor. They were craftspeople in an era that still believed manufacturing was a dignified and serious occupation, and the machines they produced were evidence of that belief. A Smith Corona Sterling from 1958 that still types today and there are thousands of them that do, is not simply a survivor. It is a document. It records in its continued function the standard that the people who built it held themselves to. No planned obsolescence, no deliberate degradation. A machine built to work, built by people who understood what working meant, for customers who expected it to last. The students who learned to type on Smith Corona machines in school classrooms across America carried that education forward into every keyboard they ever touched afterward. The muscle memory laid down on those machines, the home row, the rhythm, the reach, transferred to the electric typewriter, and then to the word processor, and then to the laptop, and then to the phone. The Smith Corona typewriter was, for an enormous portion of the American population, the original instrument of keyboard literacy. Every word typed on every device since then carries, in some untraceably small but real way, the inheritance of those hours at the long wooden tables. The brand name still exists, attached to a business that bears no meaningful resemblance to what it once was. The Thermal Label Company in New Britain, Connecticut, operates without ceremony, without nostalgia, without any apparent awareness that it is sitting on one of the most recognizable names in the history of American manufacturing. This is not unusual. Brand names outlast the things that made them meaningful all the time. The name is property. The meaning was never property. The meaning belonged to the people who used the machines, and they carried it with them when the machines stopped being made, and they carry it still. Somewhere tonight, in a house in Ohio or Oregon or Pennsylvania, a Smith Corona is sitting in a closet or an attic or on a shelf in a spare room. It has been there for years, maybe decades. The ribbon is probably dry. The case is dusty. But the machine inside is almost certainly still functional, because that is what Smith Corona machines do. They endure past every reasonable expectation, past the company that made them, past the era that needed them, past the point where anyone thought to check. If someone were to take it down, clean it, thread a fresh ribbon, feed in a sheet of paper, and begin, the keys would still have resistance. The platen would still turn. The type would still strike the page with that particular, irreplaceable authority. And at the end of the first line, the bell would ring once, clean and clear, into whatever room it found itself in, telling whoever was listening that something real had been here, that it had mattered, that it was worth remembering,